The debate over Oregon's death penalty was once a sibling rivalry. Abigail Scott Duniway and her younger brother Harvey Scott were raised in the same house, but their careers took very different turns. She was a Northwest leader of the women's suffrage movement, the Susan B. Anthony of Oregon. He edited The Oregonian, which was then what it is today, the most influential newspaper in the state. She was a progressive who refused to use the word obey in her marriage vows. He was a conservative who helped transform Oregon at the turn of the century into a Republican stronghold. She opposed capital punishment. He championed it.
We like to think of brother and sister who may be at poles but would still get together and be close and bury the hatchet, in other words. I don't think they had that kind of relationship. They kept their distance from each other.
Duniway resented her brother's power, forbidden to her because of her gender. Scott feared his sister's popular influence, which he saw as a threat to Oregon. Their relationship was always heated, but it turned nasty after Duniway founded a small suffrage paper called the New Northwest. These estranged siblings debated capital punishment endlessly in their newspapers. Duniway argued that it was a remnant of a barbarous age. Scott proclaimed that without capital punishment, civilization goes back. No one is safe. Meanwhile, hangings were the law of the land. They were faithfully performed by an executioner named Daddy Lamb. He was an accomplished professional who perfected his trade in the Philippines by sending more than 700 men to death. In Oregon, he personally executed convicted criminals in full view of hundreds of captivated citizens.
The day of execution was almost like a celebration and a martyrdom, as you have newspaper articles focusing on the attire of the prisoners, the standing at the gallows, waving to the crowd, giving last-minute speeches, a prayer being offered for them, and then going to their death.
Those executions were opposed by a vocal minority, but the death penalty law would not be seriously challenged until America's progressive era. For Oregon, the 1910s was an unusual decade. Horse-drawn carriages didn't seem so efficient anymore when you were trying to fight a fire. Women's fashion was less modest than it used to be. The state built its first modern courthouse in its busiest city. The local economy was booming. Oregonians believed that they could do great things, conquer unimaginable heights.
This old notion of power to the people is one that goes back well into the 19th century.
The country needs, and unless I mistake its temper, the country demands bold, persistent experimentation. So said Teddy Roosevelt, himself one of America's boldest, most persistent experimenters. Oregon tried out progressive politics by electing a young governor named Oswald West.
He was a Democrat when to be a Democrat in Oregon was truly to be in the minority party. And so two of his passions when he became elected in 1911 were to protect Oregon's natural resources and also to eliminate the death penalty as being an anachronism for a progressive and modern state.
This colorful man, known for his spirited grassroots organizing, was heavily influenced by his childhood icon, Abigail Scott Duniway. When he was 10 years old, he heard her speak passionately at a suffrage rally in Salem, and was a progressive ever since.
He recognized in her someone who shared his philosophical outlook, a similar idea of the future of Oregon.
Meanwhile, Harvey Scott, Oregon's most outspoken proponent of capital punishment, was dying. When his heart failed in August of 1910, his death was attended by his wife and son. There was no mention of his sister in the papers.
Perhaps he would have been more vocal, or well, obviously he would have been vocal, but I think the editorial policy of the paper was fairly clear. They printed stories on sort of the drastic things that might happen if the death penalty were abolished.
Oswald West and the Oregonian braced themselves for a bitter fight. In his inaugural address, West stated his intention to eliminate the death penalty. The next day, the Oregonian stated its intention to campaign for it. The battle lines were drawn. In the fall of 1912, Governor West placed a measure to abolish the death penalty, the first of its kind, on the November ballot. He hoped that with his political skills, he could persuade a majority of Oregonians to settle the issue. But even at the height of the progressive era, it would be a tough sell. Was Oregon ready for such a dramatic measure? Hoping to make the difference, West had a controversial plan. He granted reprieves to 4 men on death row, but only for a little while.
Oswald West, as it were, challenged the people of Oregon and said, all right, I'm going to put off the executions of these men until after the election in 1912 on the abolition of the death penalty. If you abolish the death penalty, their sentences will be commuted to life imprisonment. But if you do not abolish the death penalty, I will, as governor, let their executions go forward. And so, more than anything, in 1912, West wanted to make that election a referendum on the lives of 4 men. So he was playing chicken, I suppose you could say, with the Oregon voter.
The measure was decisively defeated. It was good news for the Oregonian, which was carrying on Harvey Scott's legacy. But it was devastating for Oswald West. He had gambled and lost. Now what? If he executed the 4 men on death row, he would be violating one of his most strongly held beliefs. Death penalty opponents argued that he should extend their reprieves again. Soon, thousands of progressive-minded women would be voting for the first time and giving abolition forces extra support. They appealed directly to his heart with passionate calls for mercy, but the governor had already made up his mind. With a pale face and tears in his eyes, he explained his decision. It is a medieval, barbaric practice. But the people of this state last month voted against the abolition of capital punishment. In letting these men hang, I am obeying the mandate of the people. They asked for this.
They did him 2 shifts of 2 in an early morning in December 1912. The execution at the state pen in Salem, where they had started being executed in 1903, they had to construct a couple more gallows so that they could do all 4 in one morning.
As far as the Oregonian was concerned, the issue was settled, perhaps forever. They were wrong. In 1913, women voted for the first time. Abigail Scott Duniway, old and frail, cast the first woman's vote in Oregon history. When thousands of other women joined her in the voting booths, it tipped the political scales and made opposition to the death penalty a competitive movement. Governor West wasted no time. Only 2 years after the last measure was defeated, the death penalty was once again in the hands of Oregon voters.
In 1914, it triumphed by 165 votes. And that is 0.04% margin of victory, the smallest margin of victory that an initiative petition has ever won by in Oregon's history.
As of December 3, 1914, Oregon's death penalty was no more. Now in the final year of his governorship, Oswald West hoped that this measure would be one of his defining legacies. But Oregon soon had other, more urgent matters to consider. World War I had begun.
Oregonians became more conservative, more conscious about threats to our society. When you become more security conscious, more protective, I think you become more conservative, especially when it comes to issues of civil liberties.
By November of 1919, Oregonians who had voted against the death penalty once again changed their minds. The catalyst for this change was murder. It happened on November 21st, 1919, when bandits robbed an established hotel and killed two very prominent men.
The state highway commissioner and a friend of his from Pendleton were in Portland, and they were murdered. Oregonians were shocked and embarrassed and angered, and this led to the movement to re-establish the death penalty in 1920.
Newly elected Portland Mayor James Baker, a staunch death penalty supporter, spoke for many when he declared his intention to make Oregon too hot for murderers. Capital punishment is necessary. I'm convinced of that. In a special election on May 21, 1920, Oregonians voted overwhelmingly to restore capital punishment to the state. Oregon's social experiment ended almost as quickly as it began. There would not be another attempt to repeal the death penalty until another social movement would create a sympathetic climate for it. That wouldn't happen again for decades to come.